Greetings everyone and welcome to our lecture today. Today our topic is an overview of Greek Platonic philosophy and its relevance to and impact on Christian understanding of truth, specifically around the time the New Testament was written and when work was being done by the early church fathers. We'll be taking a few unique perspectives through the work of various authors. The first one who will be featured is Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary. In this way, we will look at different modes of thought due to specialized thinking patterns of the right and left brain hemispheres. So following a brief overview of the characteristics of right and left brain thinking, they will be placed in historical context as to their influence on philosophy. It will also be seen that sometimes they exist in harmony and other times in opposition. We'll move to discussion of Greek philosophy in relation to the work of some of the early patristic fathers, and this will be summarizing work by Alistair McGrath. Norman Geisler will also be given from a perspective of apologetics. And finally, Harm Hollander will be looking at his work in relation to the writings of Paul and the influence of Greek philosophy on the writings of Paul in Scripture. Okay, so the right hemisphere, so you can look at the PowerPoint here, and one side is organized to represent the right hemisphere, the other to represent the left. And you can see the right hemisphere is concerned with the whole. It looks for patterns and creates connections. In contrast, the left hemisphere is characterized by directed and focused attention, and it uses analysis to unpack parts. For the right brain, creativity involves a sense of wonder and engages in unveiling and imagination. Creativity for the left brain is more mechanistic. It's about utility and the construction towards the construction of an end product. McGilchrist references Heraclitus, and he uses the term, and forgive my Greek, ankibase, which means stepping near, and Heraclitus uses this to characterize well the right hemisphere's approach to truth and understanding of the world, which is stepping near, while the left hemisphere stands back, isolates, detaches, and it detaches from nature, from others, and from self in order to objectify. The right hemisphere, through empathy and use of the affective domain, pays attention to the world, and it seeks implicit and hidden truths. In contrast, the left hemisphere has a tendency, according to McGilchrist, to be willful, grasping, and controlling, and it works as a powerful operator, mechanistically manipulating and using the world. For the right hemisphere, perception comes through the body, through the senses, and these play an important role in understanding reality, while the left hemisphere tends to focus on the inner process involving the mind and analysis through the use of reason. Expression of the left hemisphere is through using words to represent the world in ordered terms. It wants to categorize, codify, and place things in hierarchy. It values clarity and desires inertia and stability. It's more concerned with systematic and abstract description of art, history, and the natural world than it is in engaging in it. The right brain, however, engages in poetic thinking and speaks through metaphoric language. It celebrates the process, the journey, and tends to go with the flow. An important note we will return to is that McGilchrist does not attribute what he calls the great humanistic achievements to the role played by either the left hemisphere or the right, but advances come when they are seen to work in tandem. So at this point, you'll see on the screen behind me that there's some questions here. You'll be going into your breakout groups, and the discussion questions are also in the chat, and you can find them there as well. So our topic now centers more on the right relationship between the right and left hemispheres. And McGilchrist theorizes that hemisphere specialization, so distinction between the hemispheres, happens for a reason. Initially, the separative nature of the left hemisphere was important because this is how humanity came to objectify, and by this it's in a positive sense. A degree of distance, after all, is important for development, since empathy can only come through seeing the other. Involvement of the right hemisphere is also necessary in empathy because the ability to make connections is an important function of the societal right brain. At first, McGilchrist says there was equality and balance, and though he also saw that the right hemisphere had a certain degree of primacy because it had a governing function. But over time, he charts a reversal of hierarchy. And these are McGilchrist's words. The ambitious, if not grandiose, left brain came to lord it over the right brain. And this resulted in rejection of the right hemisphere and its world. He sees the left hemisphere being left to work separately and unchecked, and that this is at the root of many societal problems or pathologies in modern society today. When functioning in a balanced manner, things are sent to the left hemisphere for processing, but meaning comes when they are returned to the right hemisphere for reintegration. Through return to the experiential world, new synthesis takes place and meaning is gained. So this is discussion centering on the interaction of the right and left hemisphere needed for good functioning. It is the rejection of the right hemisphere world, and this is a world exemplified by Heraclitus, that we turn to next. So Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic thinker of the archaic period of Greek civilization, roughly 500 years before Christ. Heraclitus paid careful attention to the phenomenal world and valued first-hand experience. He used the phrase, "things as we encounter them." Heraclitus did not give priority to opinions and ideas about experience over experience. Perception and experience were more important than our theories about them. To McGilchrist's mind, Heraclitus had a balanced perspective through his awareness of the right hemisphere's perspective on reality as having also a hidden and implicit nature. For Heraclitus, logos, which is a word we will spend a little bit more time on in forthcoming slides, is a phenomenal property. It involves reason and thought, but it is in response to what is evidenced and experienced in the world. And this will be seen to contrast with left brain understanding of logos as the ultimate cause, reason, and meaning or deep structure of the world, and which came progressively through time to be seen as the power that lies behind appearances. So McGilchrist's thesis is that following the early Greek period, the left hemisphere gains dominance and leaves an indelible stamp, those are his words, on the next 2,000 years of Western. We've already looked at Heraclitus as an exemplar of right hemisphere-oriented thinking. During the pre-Socratic period, McGilchrist also identifies the mystery religion of the Dionysian cults, their superstitions and esoteric initiation rites as evidence of the primacy of the right hemisphere. However, by the 4th century, the world of right hemisphere effect of the pre-Socratic philosophers had largely given way to left hemisphere predominance of the world of Plato. Increasingly, emphasis came to be placed on cognitive abstraction by the conscious mind, and so through the left hemisphere. The shift to the left begins with the philosophy of Parmenides around 500 BC and earlier. Though Plato was born roughly 2 centuries later in the 420s of BC, Parmenides had a huge influence on Plato. In opposition to the holistic conception of Heraclitus, Parmenides separates the world of experience from the world of ideas. The power of the senses came to be seen as a source of deception, and they were not to be trusted. The place to turn for truth increasingly became an inward one, toward the contemplation of the mind. I would just like to interject at this time that these themes will be repeated over and over. This is not the first time that we will have a discussion of which is predominant, the senses and trust in the senses and experience, or in perception due to an inward turning towards reason. This is like a theme predominant when you consider modes of thinking about truth, or the reality of truth. In the left hemisphere based perception of reality, concepts of truth are arrived at through logic, and these override concepts of truth based on the observation of phenomena, at least at this time. Plato believed truth cannot be known through things that are changing or particular. Knowledge must be reliable or fixed, and it must be general. For Plato, reality exists in the realm of forms. Forms are disembodied, ideal, and universal abstractions. For every actual object that we are able to sense in a physical and experiential way, there exists an ideal form that exists in a heavenly realm. Anything we experience in the natural realm is but a shadow of a pre-existent and ideal form. While the thinking of Aristotle will be addressed in a future lesson, it bears mention that for Aristotle, truth was a reversal. Perception of truth was a reversal from that of Plato. Aristotle looked to the natural world. This is illustrated in this painting by Raphael. Plato points upward to the truth, and Aristotle points down toward nature. A further influence directed toward the left hemisphere dominance came through Stoicism. It's the highest aim of a Stoic to never lose their composure. Democritus, who was contemporary with Plato, praises the refusal to be moved, to be astonished, or amazed by anything. The mark of the true philosopher, according to Democritus, is the capacity to see things as they are, to treat a thing as an object of knowledge, to clarify it, codify it, and otherwise systematize it. The goal of Stoics is one shared by science, you could say today, and that is to demystify the world. In this later period of early Greek philosophy, truth becomes something that is proved by argument. Myth and metaphor are rejected as fictions, and that is, they represent untruths and deceit. From the time of Plato forward, according to McGilchrist, Greek philosophy is dominated by the left hemisphere. Calculation and logic are preferred over imagination. Okay, now we turn to the topic of paradox. And this is one of the concerns, it's kind of a left brain related concern raised by McGilchrist. Through emphasis on certainty, clarity, stasis, and an intolerance for ambiguity and contradiction, philosophy became blind to the possibilities presented by paradox. McGilchrist points out that separation is basic to union, and after all, there must be distinct things that in order for things to be unified. But they are of no value except that they partake, or separation is of no value, except that it partakes in a later greater union or synthesis. Those are McGilchrist's words there. And synthesis takes place out of right brain initiative. Rather than canceling one another out, Heraclitus saw that opposites need to be held together. He also had a sense of energy and life and flux and flow that underlined reality, not stasis and a state of completion. So this sense of life and flow and flux is basically inherent to a state of paradox. McGilchrist arrives at many of his conclusions from studying early Greek art, particularly portraiture, like sculpture, and he finds that the periods of greatest richness, those marked by beauty, organic quality, empathy, and the human condition, and a sense of the flow of life, are the historical periods when the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere work together in harmony. In these periods, neither hemisphere held the other back, and that's the ideal. When not compromising each other or competing with one another, both right and left hemispheres are able to reach new levels and grow to greater potentials. And McGilchrist observes that before Plato, Greek philosophers welcomed paradox and recognized the role it plays in, quote, obtaining adequate notions of any truth. After Plato, though, through the influence of the left brain, philosophy becomes increasingly blinded to the possibility of paradox. There is no true end however, to paradoxical thinking, and McGilchrist highlights modern philosophy that recognizes paradox. For Heidegger, he says that Heidegger stated along the lines that beauty lies in opposites coming to rest in one another, in connectedness. The Romantics were concerned with the reunification of poetry with philosophy, and for Coleridge, the role of philosophy was to intellectually separate reality into distinguishable parts. But then, after having done so, the conceptions or parts have to be restored to a unity where they coexist harmoniously. But one might wonder how left-brained really was Plato, because McGilchrist also quotes Plato as saying, "The sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher." And this raises the question, how left-brained was he? Partly to explore this question and partly to establish a contrast, we're going to take a moment to explore the esoteric. According to Baggini, which you will have read at this point, esoteric means truth means hidden truth. Belief in esoteric truth is ancient, dating quite likely to before recorded history. In ancient Greece, along with the public teachings of the philosophers, there were secret esoteric teachings that were revealed only to an inner circle, such as those of the Pythagoreans, for example. For those of you familiar with Gnosticism already, this will sound familiar, and for those of you who are not, this is something we'll be coming to in future lectures. The Greeks also had very mystical means for arriving at secret or prophetic truths. This is something I remember reading. I no longer have the book, but the oracle at Delphi involves a female mystic on a tripod over a vent who would go into prophecy as she inhaled the fumes of a great rotting carcass of a serpent that was buried there. So this was I guess we have been told about it, so not totally esoteric, but an interesting example of how unusual some early religious beliefs were. Mystics in many cultural traditions maintain secrets by speaking and writing in coded languages that are not understood by the laity. Okay, so in his 7th letter, Plato too said that his writings contained hints at secret teachings. Also, in classical Greece and the Hellenistic world, rites of initiation were undergone for the sake of having mystical experiences and gaining knowledge of the mysteries. So the bull leaping activity represented in this fresco is an example of initiation of the Dionysian cult. Christian and pagan Greek philosophy. This section refers now to the work of Alistair McGrath. Christianity originated in Palestine, but soon began to expand along the Mediterranean to include Egypt, Asia Minor, and Greece, as is evident in this map. These regions were under Roman rule, but it must be kept in mind that Rome had adopted Greek philosophy and applied it in very practical terms, but they did not remove themselves from Greek philosophy. So according once more to Ian McGilchrist, the great extent and solidity of Roman rule at the time of early Christianity, at least into the 4th century AD, was based in left hemisphere predominance. This took form as rigidity, but also stability, and was enacted through encoded laws, a lot of bureaucracy, and a totalitarian state. In these regions, many spoke Greek, and many were familiar with classical Greek philosophy, as I just mentioned. According to McGrath, this raised important issues for the early Christian writers. That is, the patristic fathers, but it's also seen in the Gospel of John and the writings of Paul. The issue, that is, for relating the Gospel to classical Greek philosophy. Rather than contradict classical or pagan ways of thinking, the fathers came to see these as a foundation upon which to build the Christian gospel. Classical philosophy was also seen as a form of preparation given by God to pave the way for Christianity in advance of the incarnation and death and resurrection of Christ. Clement of Alexandria and Justin Martyr are two early theologians we will look at briefly, who concerned themselves with demonstrating that Christianity was consistent with certain forms of Platonism. It should be noted, not all early Christian writers had a positive attitude to classical philosophy, and we will discuss briefly also Tertullian. So Justin was raised as a pagan. He lived between 100 to 165 BC. He converted to Christianity and became a wandering preacher, speaking to, especially in converting educated pagans. And he was an apologist. The apologists were 2nd century writers who defended Christianity against pagan criticism. And keep in mind that this was during the time of Christian martyrdom. And Justin is thought likely to be the greatest of the Christian apologists. And again, Christian apology does not end here, but it's a theme that we will be returning to throughout this course. In the theology, specifically the Logos Christology that Justin develops, he identifies Jesus with the divine Logos, which was also known by the Greeks. We have already looked at the meaning of logos as underlying cause and truth, and we're going to look now more fully at its meaning in order to more fully understand Justin's arguments. The idea of the logos were current in both Stoicism and in Middle Platonism at the time of Justin, and also in the time of the apostles. Logos, which is the Greek word for intellect or word, was considered by the classical Greeks to be the ultimate source of all human knowledge. This relates it to both human reason and to the divine mind. Through logos, basic truths such as time, creation, freedom, the human soul, and good and evil, along with many others, were able to be communicated. Justin developed the doctrine of the logos spermatikos, which translates as a seed-bearing word. Again, forgive my Greek, I have not studied Greek. His central theme is that God has scattered the seeds, or spermata, of his logos throughout the world before the coming of Christ, so that secular wisdom and truth can point, however imperfectly, to Christ. And Justin argues that Christian truth exists already implicitly in the classical philosophy of the great pagan writers. This truth is hinted at by God in their own philosophy, in the philosophy of the Greeks that is, in order to show the pagans that Christ had been predicted in history and to prepare them for the revelation of Christ as the Son of God. Christianity in this way builds upon and fulfills Justin's phrase, the hints and anticipations of God's revelations which are found in pagan philosophy. Justin argues that Christian truth about the Logos is set above the great works of the pagan philosophers because there only traces of truth can be found, giving the pagans only partial access to it, unlike the access that is given through Scripture. Through belief in the Logos, Christianity and classical philosophy also shared a belief in a transcendent and unchangeable God. In Paul's address to, or as McGrath puts it, confrontation with the Stoic pagans of Athens, the account of which is given in Acts 17, Paul argues that the unknown God, in verse 23, is a deity that Greek philosophy already had some implicit or intuitive awareness of, but remains unnamed and unknown. And Paul argues that this deity is who is made known in full through Christ. The pagans intuit the unknown God through creation, but their philosophy lacks the power to reveal him. But Christianity teaches Jesus Christ as the incarnation of the divine Logos, and Christ is named as Logos in John 1 verse 14. And so, of all fundamental and essential truth. Christ's redemptive power also had meaning for the pagans, since Justin explained that Christ came into the world to teach people the truth and also to save them from the power of demons. So in this sense, they had a sense of the importance of redemption. And though it remained controversial, the church fathers, including Augustine, tended to believe that anything that is good and true in secular philosophy can be accepted and honored by Christians, because it too derives from the Logos. So Logos is quite a unifying theme. As an apologist, like Justin Martyr, Geisler, who, as you know, authors one of the textbooks you're reading for this course, Norman Geisler, writes extensively about how through observation and induction, evidence for an unseen God can be known. By induction, which means observing something in the world repeatedly and drawing general conclusions from what's observed, for example, we know gravity exists, we know humans have 2 legs, we know that humans are mortal. From induction, general principles can be known. And this is basically the base for scientific truth claims and for discovering the truth of the premises that would be used in an argument, a logical argument. Not beyond all doubt, after all, do we know for certain that all humans are mortal? Nonetheless, conclusions reached through inductions are highly probable, certain beyond a reasonable doubt, and may require some faith, however. Natural or general revelation of God is independent of special revelation given through Scripture and can be discovered without the use of the Bible through good reason, science, and philosophy. And the Bible itself, McGrath points out, says this. For example, Psalms 19 and Romans 1 verses 18 to 20. So moral truth is another example of self-evident truth. It's not based on scientific evidence, but it's a non-material source for truth. Geisler argues that for all humanity there is a shared sense of obligation to help others, a fundamental sense of right and wrong, of justice, injustice, an intuitive sense to do good and to shun evil. Everyone can distinguish between life, love, courage, and gratitude on one hand, and hate, racism, abuse, cowardice, and murder on the other. Because this moral prescription or moral law has been inscribed on the minds and hearts of all humanity, this points to God as the moral law prescriber. So, now after a little preamble, we move to the second of our patristic fathers, which is Clement of Alexandria, who lived between 150 to 215 AD. He was an Alexandrian writer, which means he's from the West, in relation to the East, which was Antioch. In a way similar to Justin, Clement sees Christ as the perfection and fulfillment of Greek philosophy, but he does add a few further points. He sees classical philosophy in a positive light, and theology that it was a route, one made providential through God, that led to and prepared pagans for Christianity. Rather than a worldview that led away from Christianity, pagan philosophy has a different place in the economy of salvation. So that's something that Clement is adding to the discussion. To support his thesis, he developed an analogy. As God gave the Jews the law of Moses to prepare Israel for the coming of Christ, God likewise gave to the Greeks, as a way of preparing them for the coming of Christ, Greek philosophy, and also a way towards perfection in Christ. He does not give philosophy, Clement doesn't give philosophy the status of revelation, but after the coming of Christ, he saw it as having an ongoing important role as a kind of preparatory training. He wrote, "For the philosophy acted as a schoolmaster to bring the Greeks to Christ, just as the law brought the Hebrews." So Tertullian was from the West, and he is renowned for having written, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem, or the academy with the church?" And by this he means the Platonic Academy at Athens. Tertullian felt the pagan outlook of secular Greek philosophy was profoundly misleading for Christian belief and would lead to heresy within the church. He said, "The heresies themselves receive their weapons from philosophy." Tertullian placed emphasis on orthodoxy, and this meant emphasis on the importance of historical continuity and the role of tradition, specifically apostolic succession. So in other words, the church being handed down through a succession of bishops, and with it the truth of the church. Orthodoxy meant remaining historically continuous with and theologically dependent upon the apostles and their truth. This ruled out pagan philosophy since, as he said, the heretics have no such continuity. Tertullian is a point in case for how not all early Christian writers had a positive attitude to classical philosophy. And before moving on to the next topic, though, I'd like to mention that Augustine did have a positive outlook on the Greek philosophy in a utilitarian sense.